Now, some of the more common problems of the throat chakra are that it will act independently. So what we also find is that there's a difference in time scale. So the lower chakras are working on a much slower time scale, while the higher chakras are in a way in a higher vibration, they respond more quickly. So if a person is asking you, what do you want, or how are you feeling, what would you like to do? And ultimately such a question should be answered by the second chakra, what do you want, or what would you like to do, the third chakra, how are you feeling, by the heart chakra. But the question itself is coming in on the throat level. So the first response is usually also coming from the throat chakra, because while all the other chakras are still thinking about it, like, okay, what do I want? What do I want to do? How am I feeling? The throat chakra will already have responded, oh, I'm fine, and you? Or something of that nature. And that also means that intentionally or unintentionally we tend to lie. We tend to give responses which are based solely on the higher chakras, with the exclusion of the lower chakras. So we're in a way talking with just our heads, not with our bodies. And this leads also to a lack of food, a lack of attention for these lower chakras, because they don't get to open up, they don't get to interact with the people around them, except through the throat chakra. So many people are only fed with higher vibrations. They're not fed on an emotional level, they're not supported in their actions. Their needs are not felt, they're also not accepted, because simply things are moving too rapidly. Time is money, everybody has a lack of time these days, everybody's living by the clock, by the agenda, paid by the hour. So time is at a premium. It has to be used efficiently, and the higher chakras have a higher clock speed than the lower chakras. So we end up, by the changes in society, only using these higher chakras. And the overuse of these higher chakras is ultimately very unstabilizing. Because the higher chakras, they're sensitive, but they're also ultimately coping mechanisms. They help us to survive in the current problem, in the current crisis. They don't really give us more of a long-term or strategical view or purpose. Like if I love a person, then I want to do something with that person. If I have a desire or a dream of becoming a great sportsman or having a career as an architect, then those desires can guide my life on a long-term level. These higher chakras, they only help us to eat healthy, to say what is appropriate, to be effective, to be efficient, but they don't give us purpose. And this is where things often go wrong, when we start mistaking our coping mechanisms for being good and purposeful. So it is essential that we understand the limitations of this chakra and therefore are also able to shut it off when the situation arises when it would be best not to listen to these higher chakras. This is usually a very, very tricky thing, because behavior, according to the throat chakra, is rewarded. Like everybody is happy that you are such a good boy or such a good girl, and as such, there is a benefit to being so, and talking about your emotions or being very willful or doing things in your own way. It's usually not rewarded at all. So also these higher chakras get fed, get nourished by other people a lot, while these lower chakras tend to be starved from energy. So we can say as a whole that modern society and how we interact with each other is very unbalanced. It's very poisonous. But it's also a reality we have to deal with, we have to live with, and we have to accept. Hence also that the higher chakras tend to be better developed, stronger than the lower chakras. But this in itself is also a problem, because this is not our natural state, it's not our natural balance. So one of the things which also happens is, because of it, is in a way often there's a blockage in the prana tube, that these higher chakras will work together, the throat, the forehead and the crown, and will in a way exclude the rest of the body from those decision-making processes, because they're too slow, they're too emotional, they're too selfish to get involved. And these are often the judgments people have towards themselves. Like, I should not be so emotional, I should not be so stubborn to do things my own way, or I should not be so selfish to put my own desires forth so much. And indeed, it is very unpolite and civilized to do so, but that doesn't make it a bad thing. It can be a very good thing, at least for yourself, maybe not for society. But ultimately it is also a process of maturity, because as we mature life after life, more and more of these values which come from culture, which come from religion, will have been integrated into our own third chakra, so we will already behave in ways which are good and proper, because it is natural to us. So it is also basically about maturity, about having lived enough lifetimes to have such behavior naturally, rather than having the need for such behavior to be taught to you. This can be also very confusing, because if you do have this kind of behavior already naturally, then having this behavior taught to you, or actually having a rather crude version, a more primitive version, a less evolved version of this behavior being taught to you, is actually detrimental, because you might be taught values and standards which are far below your own. So rather than that society and your teachers are improving you and your behavior, they might make it worse, because the society might be worse. It might be a more selfish, a more primitive, a lower caste society than what you're used to. So it's a very tricky thing to really find out what is good and what is bad about the throat chakra, and you cannot really do that unless you consider the development of the lower chakras as well. Is the higher chakra trying to advance the lower chakras, or is it holding back the lower chakras? And ultimately it has to learn its role. It has to accept that either it is much more primitive and these lower chakras have more maturity, and that it is to function just as a tool for this, in a way, inborn wisdom which is already there, or should it serve as a guide, as a teacher for these lower chakras? Tricky. What is generally a problem is that the throat chakra, by its very nature, it is a little bit rigid, because it has to have a model of society, of the world around it. It is how we understand the world. It is in a way the framework we use for all our actions. So the framework has to be a little bit stable, but if it is too stable, it also becomes very constraining. We cannot think out of the box anymore. We cannot be creative anymore. We can only do what is expected, or what is the standard method. So a lack of structure within the throat chakra makes us very ill adapted to society, but it also makes us very creative. It allows us to be an artist, to make music, to be a philosopher. But on the other hand, it also makes us often dysfunctional within relationships, within work situations, within society. So there's in a way a price to pay if you have a rather chaotic or ill-adapted throat chakra. On the other hand, if you're too well adapted, you turn into a robot, a slave, who is just obeying the will of the invisible masters, which are basically just the standards and rules, and you become a servant of the law of the land, and merely a continuation of a blind mechanism, like economy or like the market economy especially. It has a will of its own in a way, even though it is composed of people. It is no longer controlled by people, but rather controlling them. So do you feel like being controlled by some blind system which has no purpose and cannot guide you, neither spiritually nor intellectually nor emotionally? No. You're just being dragged along on a very horizontal level. All your energy is also dissipated by this movement on a very horizontal level. So ultimately, such things lead to feelings of depression. And no matter how hard you work, how much you do, you will always feel it is not enough. Because the lower chakras are dissatisfied. And no matter how much work is produced according to the society, it will not satisfy your internal needs. And this is often a problem which causes people to move into burnout. That they're listening too much to the throat chakra and not enough to their lower chakras. So the essence of the throat chakra is very much an essence of trying to create balance between the inner world and the outer world. When you're alone, you should be able to turn off the throat chakra. You should be able to be creative, to think creatively, to grant yourself that freedom. And when you're in society, you should be able to turn on the throat chakra, to be able to communicate, to know how to behave, to know how to express yourself, how to come across in a way that other people understand you, respect you, will respond to you. So it is a tricky balance, not just what is the truth, but also how to express the truth, how to communicate it, how to create the right effect. It's not so much about what you feel like doing, but also what effect you want to create. So rationality enters into it. So if we find too much light blue in this chakra, it is usually an indication that it has become very rigid. And if the blue gets more rich, more deep in the throat chakra, it's usually that it's more creative, more aware. So the hue of the chakra is very important to strike a good balance between order and chaos. The shape of the chakra in general is usually a little bit flattened. So instead of being completely round, it tends to be flat. Because we're usually not communicating about or to lower chakras. We're not talking to other people's hearts or bellies. Neither are we talking to the higher powers, to the guides, to the spirits, to the gods. So we, because of our habits, tend to have a very flat throat chakra rather than a rounded one, which would be natural for a human being to have a rounded one, to talk as much with your guides and the gods and to your own body as to other people. So we tend to, in a way, use the throat chakra just for external communication and not enough for internal communication or spiritual communication. So this is one deformation of the chakra, which is unfortunately quite common in modern day European and North American society. Another problem is the balance, because usually people are quite decent at talking, but horrible at listening. So the throat chakras tend to really go forward quite a bit, quite well developed, but have a very poorly developed rear. So we're able to express ourselves, because expressing is also seen often as a contest, not just merely revealing who you are, what you're doing, what is going on with you, but also, in a way, fighting for place, for attention, for time, from the loved one, from the teacher, from the boss. You want to be heard. The more time you get, the more important you are, the more attention you get, the more accepted you feel, and we use the throat chakra as a weapon to get that. And the more weaponized the throat chakra becomes, the more rigid it becomes, and the more narrow it becomes, and the more forward it becomes. So people who use their voice as a weapon tend to have a very narrow, very rigid, very long throat chakras. And using it as a weapon usually also means that you're not really listening or learning from the people around you anymore. So by, in a way, weaponizing your throat chakra, you're in a way putting it into write-only mode. You can write instructions onto other people's energy systems, but you cannot read what the rest of the world is trying to teach you, is trying to tell you anymore. Because everything anybody else says to you, you see as an attack, as somebody trying to take away your time, your space, your independence, your importance, your attacking your judgment, your morals. And often people who have a position of authority within a religion, within a government, within a company, tend to have these weaponized throat chakras, which ultimately stifle their own development, their own growth, and thereby eventually also turn them into very lousy leaders, because they cannot listen to the people anymore. And if you cannot listen, so your understanding starts to disappear. What understanding they build up before they weaponized it is no longer updated by changing circumstances, by changing times, by people evolving around them. And people tend to hang on to very obsolete ideas, very obsolete images. They fossilize themselves by being in a situation of constant conflict. So for us to be able to learn, to grow, it is also very necessary that we're not in situations of constant verbal conflict, because the deformation of the throat chakra really hampers the process of learning, of understanding each other, and ultimately thereby destroys harmony between us and other people. And without harmony, ultimately also we start trying to force harmony on other people by creating dramas in our lives, by getting attention, by being in a way naughty, intrusive, obtrusive, and unpleasant in our communications, being demanding. And ultimately, these kinds of misbehaviors are usually disguised cries for help, like, help, I'm not being seen, I'm not being heard, I'm unable to harmonize with other people, I feel unsupported. But it is very hard for other people to feel sympathy towards people who are acting like bullies and are in a way blackmailing other people to give them that love and attention and importance. So it's very important to try to break people out of these destructive behaviors, because on the short term there are rewards. for having a very strong and rigid throat chakra, because yes, you have the floor, you have everybody's attention, but on the long term it will alienate you, and it is also quite likely it will make you insane. People with very strong throat chakras, they often tend towards insanity, because their own idea of a perfect and ideal world will start to dominate them, and they're unable to see the world around them. They're unable to even realize who they are, what is going on with them, and they lose all guidance, and they become really a slave to their own ideals, to their own dreams, to their own fantasies. So, strong chakra, not always good. So for people with weak throat chakras, they tend to find other ways of communicating. Rather than saying something, they will just feel, or they will do, or they will share, and often these behaviors are seen as being weird or socially inadequate. So rather than saying, I really like you, they might end up having sex with somebody, or hugging them, or giving away their car to somebody. And these behaviors for many people are seen as, well, a little bit insane or weird, but it is the only option people have. If you cannot really communicate with your throat, you have to use other chakras to communicate with. And often the behavior is seen as being very grand or excessive or manipulative even. But it is rather an honest, a slightly twisted behavior, because there is no other option. So if you see people behaving in such a way that they feel that mere words cannot express their feelings, and they need other ways to express their gratitude or their thoughts or their respect, then it can often be that the throat chakra really needs to develop further, and that people need to find other ways of communicating, of expressing, and often they've been taught not to. Often they've been taught that in a way these lower things, emotions, desires, impulses, are indeed lower things, and often they have kind of a mental concept which they've been taught that lower energies are bad, they're worse, they're evil, they're not to be trusted, they're primitive, and that higher energies, they're rational and good and social. And this kind of judgment, this kind of like cutting the world in two and cutting the person into a good part and a bad part, it's very detrimental for the development of a healthy and functional throat chakra. So first, these convictions have to be corrected, so that the person will not see their own lower vibrations as being evil or wicked or sinful or anything like this, but will just accept that they are of equal value as their higher vibrations are. And only when that is done, then they can open up their throat chakras to these impulses and start expressing them verbally or in a socially acceptable manner. We often find that such blockages happen a lot when people have been raised in a very strict religious environment, or in a very strict culture where there's a lot of taboos, things which are not to be said, not to be done, not to be talked about, and especially if there is something which needs to be hidden, like a family secret or similar things, then the blockages can become even stronger. And it is also something which carries on from generation to generation. So if you grow up with parents who are unable to communicate, then often your own ability to communicate will also be stunted, because you never learn how to communicate in a healthy way in the important phases of your life. which is usually from 10, 12 years onward. And if you cannot build, in a way, a social model of yourself as you should be in society, then often also the person with such a weak and undeveloped throat chakra will find themselves without a niche in society. They cannot see where they fit in. They cannot realize how they could benefit or become an important part of a relationship or even a job or a society. And often these people who are in a way unable to find their own place, they tend to look to people who have a very well developed throat chakra to in a way show them their place, to give them their place. So they often go to charismatic leaders, which can be political leaders or social leaders or religious leaders, who will basically herd them like so many dumb sheep and put them in their own, to work for their own little plans. And on the one hand, the person will have found a place within a greater whole, but this is not a place which is natural or healthy for them. So this is also not a good solution to their problem, a good solution to their need. But if you see people who have a very strong need to follow and to become part of a certain culture or a certain political view or a certain religion, this is usually due to an underdevelopment of the throat chakra, that they feel such a need. And once, in a way, this throat chakra starts to develop and the lower chakras also get more space to penetrate into the higher energy centers, then these needs will tend to disappear and to dissipate, because people will be more aware of their own nature and more able to follow and define their own paths rather than have it defined for them. But the imperative of being a part of society, being accepted by society, is very strong. So most people tend to go into this leadership addiction before they get out of it.